Vietnam War demonstrations in the 60s. The government set up an inquiry into how the demonstration had been policed and to see if any blame for the damage could be laid at their door. The general conclusion was that most of the trouble came from people whose nearest political definition was anarchist. They had deliberately set out to cause mayhem in the capital, using the anti-poll tax demonstration as a pretext. Life went on as usual indoors. Outside in the street, more than 500 people had been arrested and charged with looting, criminal damage, and assaulting the police. Rioting apart, there was no doubt that the imposition of the poll tax was causing immense damage to the credibility of the government. And already there were mutterings among conservative backbenchers that if the scenes at Trafalgar Square weren't to be repeated, some modification of the charge was a political necessity. Fazad Bazoft, an Iranian-born journalist working for the Observer newspaper, was arrested in Iraq and charged with spying. After 7 weeks in isolation, he supposedly confessed and was sentenced to death. He was executed a few days later, to the great distress of his colleagues on the paper. Before winter was finally over, it left a legacy of damage round many of Britain's coastal resorts. North Wales was one of the worst affected areas. Huge waves smashed a 200 yards hole in the sea wall at Tywyn. The water poured into the streets and houses with nothing to stop it. The first task was to rescue everyone trapped in their homes. "2,000 people were evacuated to local schools and halls while work went on to repair the damage to the seawall. The miracle was that no one was hurt. The whole rescue operation lasted several days, but it was weeks before some people could return to their homes. In the Vatican, the splendors of the Sistine Chapel were on view once more. The grime of centuries had been removed to reveal Michelangelo's paintings in all their marvelous glory. Strangeways prison in Manchester, the worst riots in British penal history, kept the nation glued to the television for more than 3 weeks. The trouble began when a group of prisoners overpowered a warder in the prison chapel and stole his keys, and after an orgy of violence and destruction, broke through to the prison roof and the gaze of the cameras and public below. The whole thing may have looked something like a circus spectacle, but the prison governor, Brendan O'Friel, whose wish to send his men in at the beginning was overruled by the Home Office, had no doubts about how serious it all was.
What we know about the injuries that prisoners have inflicted upon each other is another example of the extent of the violence and what I would actually describe as an explosion of evil that took place on Sunday.
Eventually, after 25 days of lawlessness, just 5 prisoners remained on the roof. More negotiations took place. BBC reporter Mike Mackay described how the siege was finally brought to an end.
Just after 9 o'clock this morning, 2 of the prisoners appeared on the roof, much as they had every morning since the start of the siege. The sound of a police helicopter was not unfamiliar. But this was. 5 prison officers suddenly appearing in the foxhole of B Wing, created and occupied by the prisoners themselves since the start of the siege. The operation to take Strangeways by force secured the whole of the prison except the roof surface within 23 minutes. From then on, it was a kind of pincer movement, closing down the prisoners' room for manoeuvre step by step. Some of the prisoners responded as if totally ignorant of the grimness of their situation. One man took to scaling the roof of the rotunda and sat perilously on the top as 150 prison officers fanned through the roofs of the wings. An early success was the capture of the youngest prisoner, 17-year-old Darren Jones, caught, according to a Home Office official, when he wandered into a prison riot squad. The storming operation now entered its most dangerous phase. There were suddenly 3 or 4 holes, and prison officers were creating them. 2 prisoners rushed across to the roof of the chapel when one officer was seen trying to unroll coils of steel to restrict the movement of the prisoners. After a struggle, the attempt was abandoned, but there then followed sporadic resistance from the prisoners. By early afternoon, the situation seemed to be settling down into the pattern that has marked this siege all the way. One moment, unhurried, almost casual negotiations between the 2 sides. And then, as the officers tried to expand their control, violent clashes as the hosepipes were turned on the inmates. Williams and Taylor turned their backs as the roof surface became treacherous. The clash dramatized why the prison authorities were so worried about staging an assault. Barricades had been cleared, the officers had control of all the inside of the prison, but running battles across steep Victorian roofs would jeopardize the lives of prisoners and prison officers. At this point, 7 hours after the operation began, it was difficult to see how the officers could consolidate their success, given that for them, the roofs were virtually no-go areas. Late into the afternoon, the officers' strategy became clearer. A demolition gang was taking apart a huge part of the chapel roof. It cut off the retreat to other wings, pinning down the prisoners on the outer corner of F Wing. As the truth of their position dawned upon them, the prisoners began talking to officers below. They were talking of their terms for surrender. They were prepared to come down in a hydraulic hoist in full view of the outside world. They wouldn't leave through the roof, for fear, they said, of their treatment from prison officers out of sight. Shortly before 6:30, the final phase began. All 5 men climbed into the hoist. Their protest was over. Acknowledging the spectators outside, they descended slowly to the ground, where a doctor and 2 other observers were among the reception group. Cut off from food and water, the prisoners were left with no choice. That they were brought down safely against formidable odds was high tribute to the prison officers, many of whom exchanged congratulations when it was finally over.
Customs officers in northeast England took a close look at a ship bringing in what was described in its papers as petroleum piping. Defense experts called in to examine the cargo were convinced they were looking at the barrel of a huge gun. They were right. Iraq was trying to import parts for a super gun designed to fire nuclear shells hundreds of miles. Another sinister side of Middle East politics, the taking of hostages, eased slightly with the release of 2 Americans. The first was Robert Polehill.
This was an emotional reunion. Robert Polehill with his Lebanese wife, Faraya, for the first time for 3 years.
Yes, I'm very happy. Yes, I'm coming. Okay.
She had walked the streets of West Beirut where she lived, knowing her husband could be held anywhere, and she was powerless to secure his release. Indeed, it was in West Beirut that Mr. Polehill was handed over. In a fleeting, sinister moment, he is transferred from the back of one car and taken to another. Freedom secured in a second. A tired, gaunt man, formerly a professor at Beirut University College, gets his first view of the outside world for 39 months.
Go for start. We are go for main engine start, T-minus 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope, our window on the universe.
The window on the universe was the Hubble Space Telescope.
Standing by for SRB separation.
But it was a trip that didn't go quite as planned.
Rocket boosters have separated.
Hubble's a beautiful beautiful sight with that background.
To start with, the deployment of the world's most expensive satellite went smoothly. The telescope was grabbed by the remote manipulator arm and gently lifted from its cradle in the payload bay. Mission controllers in Maryland completed a series of checks, while for an hour or more it was held parallel to the shuttle. When they were finally happy, the arm was extended, and they began to unfurl the British-made solar arrays. Slowly, the one on the port side unwound until its full 12-metre length was extended. But when they tried to unfurl the one on the other side, the problems began. Despite 2 attempts, it wouldn't budge. The astronauts, Bruce McCandless and Catherine Sullivan, prepared for a possible spacewalk to carry out repairs. But eventually the engineers suspected an instrument fault, overrode the computer, and the deployment of the other solar array went ahead. The solar panels, made in Bristol, will generate 5 kilowatts of electricity to power the satellite. The telescope is the most complex satellite ever launched. A team of nearly 700 people will be involved in operating it and logging its results.
Britain's youth, well, 100,000 of them, flocked to Wembley Stadium for a very special pop concert. The guest of honour was Nelson Mandela, who we saw released from prison earlier in the tape. It was the climax of the ANC leader's 2-day Easter visit to Britain. The crowds gave him a rousing welcome.